to us about retreating from what? The language of well-being in Australia. Over to you, Cass.
Thank you, Susie. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. As mentioned, I'm Cass. I'm a student in Master of General and Applied Linguistics at ANU. And it's my pleasure to be presenting to you today. I was delighted just to attend this symposium, so to be presenting is very exciting, and so thank you for having me. This study was conducted through coursework under the Digital Humanities and Public Culture Research Project. It was a preliminary investigation into the language of wellbeing in Australia. My area of interest is in the effect of wellbeing vocabulary on wellbeing practices and perceptions. So I looked at this from a linguistic relativity perspective, so the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. And whilst some rejections of Whorf's ideas on this have been based in a monolingual perspective, scholars who argue for his ideas speak of them being planted in a multilingual perspective. So some recent literature in support of this multilingual perspective include Tom Lomas's work in positive psychology and his proposal for a cross-cultural lexical map of well-being as a means to increasing awareness of and understanding of emotional concepts through cross-linguistic articulation. I'd just like to highlight too, though, that Lomas speaks of not being able to transplant vocabulary directly from one cultural context to another. I'll come back to that a little later on. Regarding language and well-being, I'd like to draw your attention to a study which was popularised through the National Geographic and Dan Wetner called the Blue Zones. The Blue Zones are 5 longevity hotspots that were identified throughout the world as communities who consistently lived beyond 100 years old and experienced consistently high levels of well-being. Within these communities, 9 common lifestyle factors were identified as contributing to longer, healthier living. One of these was a vocabulary for purpose. Another finding in the Blue Zone study was a concept of life radius, this being the immediate 5-mile radius of one's home and the impact of that radius on one's mental health and well-being. I'll come back to that later, but just drawing attention to one of the Blue Zones, Okinawa, Japan. Of interest in the Blue Zone study was the word Ikigai. This translates to a reason for being or a reason for waking up in the morning. And this is an integrated, activated part of the vocabulary in Okinawa, part of everyday life. Chevreau and Jack conducted a study and produced a paper on the concept of Ikigai from an English language and Western culture perspective in 2016. And their concluding recommendations included incorporating Ikigai into plans for retirement. Their suggestion was that Ikigai in Okinawan culture, the word and the concept replaced retirement in English language and Western culture. So my focus in this study was on escapism and language around escapism when referring to and in the context of wellbeing practices, such as yoga and meditation. So just to compare the notion of escapism, which is the tendency to seek distraction and relief from unpleasant realities, especially by seeking entertainment or engaging in fantasy, to wellbeing practices such as yoga, which translate to union and is based in connection, and meditation, which is to focus one's mind, to think deeply about, or to plan mentally. My methodology for this one, again, this was conducted through digital humanities. So this was with a heavy digital focus. And I would like to mention and thank my professors, Terry and Katrina here, who were hugely supportive in taking me through the methodology, as well as Cynthia. I provided a link to her tutorial on scraping data from Twitter, which was a totally new world to me. And she worked quite closely with me in being able to do this. So I developed an app through Twitter, something I never thought that I would say, to scrape data through RTweet, linguistic coding program. And I filtered for the following. I filtered for key terms and context terms, which I'll speak about in a moment. In the English language, I included replies, I excluded retweets, so I wasn't doubling up on data. And I later manually filtered for data from Australia. Following this, I conducted a word frequency search and an n-gram search in AntConc, looking for words occurring singularly and together, and then conducted a qualitative analysis of the Australian data. So the search terms of interest to me were retreat, escape, unplug, and switch off. I conducted these searches individually, along with any of the terms wellness, well-being, or health. The following is what I came up with, and this wordgram that you're seeing on the screen here shows the most frequently used terms. In the top 10, we had health, escape, retreat, mental health, wellness, people, wellness retreat, well-being, time, and lockdown. So in 2020, I think we're always going to come up with some interesting results. Lockdown and COVID factored into a lot of the data, which links back to this concept of life radius, this 5 mile, or in the Australian context, our 5 kilometre lockdown radius in Melbourne, for example, and the effects that this has on well-being. So to break this down, looking at the word retreat, this returned 315 results. And within the top 10 of those were retreat, wellness, wellness retreat, well-being, mental health, yoga, meditation, healing, spa, and mindfulness. That's not to say that COVID and lockdown weren't mentioned, they certainly were, but these were just the top 10. And I would propose that this is perhaps a more integrated, understood term in well-being vocabulary, the word retreat. Zooming in on the Australian data, I've just snapshotted a couple of tweets here, which I'll read out to you now. Friday morning inspiration. Many of you are looking forward to a restful weekend, no doubt. I'm getting ready to join a bunch of people to go on a retreat, to get connected, take part in a health and wellbeing program, and to be with nature and trusted friends. So just to speak about this one briefly, I chose this specifically because it somewhat contradicts the idea of escapism in the context of well-being. The person is speaking about connection, but it's still in this context of having to retreat from this life radius, retreat from daily routine, which is something that I find quite interesting and seems to be consistent across the data. The second tweet says, stay safe all, I'm off to a yoga retreat for 48 hours with hashtags for well-being and mental health. And then it says disconnecting in 3, 2, 1. So quite the opposite to this previous tweet, which was focused on connection. Disconnection is something that also popped up quite a few times and may begin to answer the question of what it is that people are retreating from. So in this context, it was a disconnection from social media. And we'll see that this is quite a frequent focus. The last tweet says that 2-day yoga retreat I have starting tomorrow is looking like an unbelievably good for my mental health, and then has hashtags regarding the election. I find this one interesting because though the election didn't pop up in those top 10 most frequently used terms, certainly was mentioned quite a lot across the data. And again, there's this idea of the need to escape or disconnect from current happenings or from reality, which certainly connects to studies in psychology on escapism, which I'll come back to in a moment. The word frequency for escape returned the most results of the data set. This was 738. Within the top 10, escape, health, mental health, people, care, well-being, COVID, lockdown, wellness, and healthcare. So again, COVID and lockdown factor quite heavily into this particular data set, with this contextualization of, again, the notion of life radius, this 5-mile radius of our home. And in this set, a perception of needing to escape from that in order to tend to well-being. In the Australian data set, I have 3 tweets to speak about here. The first says, as someone like many who grew up in the country and has friends and family still back there, you can't underestimate the relief that being able to get out of Melbourne again. Getting that escape is huge for mental health. I found this interesting because there is a mention of people and place to which this person has a connection. but the focus is still on escape from Melbourne, escape from the lockdown radius, the life radius, whichever one we're going to use, rather than connection to place and people. The second tweet reads, Melbourne awakens. There's people around again, so many of them. So in the spirit of preserving our fragile mental health, we must selfishly exercise escape from #boards. And then there's a quotation on that. This focus on selfishness is something that I came across a few times as well. So selfishness and escapism in relation to well-being. There is this reflection of a perception that well-being practices or tending to health and well-being are indulgent, which again relates to psychological studies on escapism, which are often referring to negative practices or self-destructive practices, such as drug taking. So I find it interesting that there's a selfish or indulgent perception or expression around well-being in this data set. The last one says, my mental health journey. I'm just having to move my screen around a little. My mental health journey, just kidding, but I have started walking to escape myself for an hour a day and it's going okay. So this relates to a couple of studies, I'll reference them at the end, in psychology, which talk about what it is people are escaping from, one of those being the self. So I found that one an interesting one to highlight. The third search term was unplug. This delivered 200 results. The top 10 were unplug, mental health, time, care, election, today, social media, wellness, self-care, and vote. So already in the top 10, we have social media. I find it interesting that unplug, which we can relate to plugging of electronic devices, is already shifting toward a more digital focus. And then, of course, the election and voting are in there as well. So essentially this reality from which people were expressing a need to escape throughout the data. Interestingly, with unplug, and we'll talk about with switch off as well, there was quite an overlap in the use of the word between reference to electronic devices and digital devices and reference to mind and overthinking. And often it wasn't, the distinction wasn't made, which I found really fascinating. And I wonder if that perhaps points to this highly digitized society. And again, I think that this can be expected, scraping data from a platform like Twitter, that there will be a digital focus, but also may sort of confirm that idea that people are escaping from social media and this digital lifestyle. In the Australian data, just one tweet popped up, and this was tagging another Twitter user saying, best of luck in your new adventure and good on you for both taking the plunge and talking so openly about mental health battles. I hope you enjoy getting to unplug for a bit. So here, unplug is used quite generically. It doesn't make reference to a specific digital or electronic device. It doesn't make specific reference to unplugging the mind. But what I also found interesting, so here they speak of mental health battles, but something that I noticed across the data was the use of mental health as synonymous with mental illness or mental health issues. So we saw that tweet before that spoke about having to escape myself. Some other tweets that I saw included having to escape my mental health. So interesting to see health used as synonymous with the opposite. The last search term was switch off. This delivered 169 results, and the frequency showed off, switch, health, mental health, and well-being in the top 5, time, help, news, stress, and COVID following those. So again, COVID factors in stress. I think these are fairly direct answers to what people are trying to escape from. And in the Australian data, a couple of tweets to highlight here. The first says, try to switch off. Doom scrolling won't change the outcome, but it will impact your mental health. So there is a reference to social media here. Doom scrolling refers to that incessant scrolling through social media for no particular purpose or end. But switch off, like unplug, is used quite generically once again. So I find that interesting, and perhaps this is pointing to a heavy reliance on an integration of digital and electronic devices. The second tweet says, at this time, I'd like to remind everyone that it's okay to switch off the news. It's okay to avoid social media. It's okay to focus on your own mental health and well-being. Don't let anyone pressure you into thinking otherwise. Looking after yourself is not selfish. I wanted to highlight this one because though there's a focus on well-being and self-care being important and valid, there is a perception of the need to remind people of that. And the capitalization of not would suggest that there is a perception of selfishness or indulgence in engaging in well-being practices. And as I mentioned, that was something that I saw a few times. So this got me curious about the way in which people were speaking of Ikigai in Australia. The first tweet I'll draw your attention to was written by someone whose profile was in Japanese, but this tweet was in English. It reads, to me, the people selling the whole Ikigai and other amazing Japanese lifestyle books are the proper definition of cultural appropriation. It's just so sleazy to be promoting this uniquely Japanese thing that will fix your life and not actually be Japanese. The second reads, and this was by someone whose profile was in the English language, our Ikigai is different for all of us, but one thing we have in common is that we are all searching for meaning. When we spend our days feeling connected to what is meaningful to us, we live more fully. When we lose the connection, we may feel empty. So two quite contrasting tweets, but I think that both of them are confirming of a couple of points that Tom Lomas made. The first, that we cannot simply transplant terms from one cultural context to another. But the second being that perhaps this cross-cultural lexical map for well-being is something that will be of benefit in increasing people's awareness and an understanding of emotional concepts. The reason I say that is this second tweet is expressing an awareness and understanding of Ikigai and the benefits for well-being around connecting to one's purpose. But what's unique about Ikigai in the Okinawan culture is that this is an integrated and activated part of the vocabulary. It's part of everyday life. So whilst an expression of understanding is happening in this second tweet, it's disconnected from this very integrated approach that is taken in Okinawan culture. So what? Perhaps it's interesting, but what does this mean? Well, if we know that language affects thought and that the world's longest lived employ a vocabulary for purpose, this study highlights a possible disconnect between wellbeing practices and daily life in Australia, and in particular, a desire to escape physically and mentally, including escape from life radius, the immediate surrounds to which people have been or are restricted during COVID-19 lockdown. If perceptions include both a need to escape and a selfishness around well-being, and if words or concepts like Ikigai can't be simply transplanted into Western culture, the question this begs is how can people adjust their language to better connect with the purpose and practice of well-being in a sustainable and integrated way? Just to quickly highlight the limitations of this study, the scope and digital focus were quite restrictive. The time period and permissions for accessing data through Twitter are only 6 to 9 days. And Twitter was the only platform that I was able to access this kind of data from. Instagram, where I had initially directed my focus, just doesn't have those types of permissions. Filtering for location also proved to be very difficult, which is why I ended up manually filtering for those tweets from Australia, which means that I may have missed out on data because people can choose not to specify their location. I really feel like this has just scratched the surface. In future, I'd really love to extend this beyond mainstream Australians. I'd like to investigate and invest the language as described and discussed through policy, media, and scientific papers, and to include other social media and wellness community platforms, magazines, advertisements. Thank you so much for your time.
Wonderful. Thank you, Cass.
Thanks, Susie.
So please feel free to write a question in chat or just indicate that you have a question for Cass by raising your hand or turning on your video. Cass, while people are gathering their thoughts, if I could ask a question about the kind of curating that people do on Twitter of their public image, and how much you think this sort of curating element means that they're kind of talking the talk in a way rather than expressing something authentic, or they're trying to recruit approval by talking about disconnecting when in fact what they're doing is frantically connecting. I wondered if you'd had any thoughts about that.
That's a really interesting question. Thank you, Susie. I think that it's rather an ironic space to conduct a study like this. Certainly, I suppose I haven't thought in depth about that. It's definitely something that I'd like to dig deeper into. The study was born from simply my own perceptions around the kind of language that was being expressed. When I heard people walk into the yoga studio, for example, I'm a yoga teacher, and I often heard people saying, I just need to switch off, or I just need to, and I had a reaction to that because the purpose of practices like yoga are to connect. So, I mean, that doesn't so much answer your question, but I sort of found myself wanting to escape from conducting this in the digital realm, and I was unable to. So I think that to delve further into that, you know, curation of image on social media would be really good. Also really challenging because it's just so, there's such an overlap now between image and actual life in social media. And I think the lines are very often blurred. So that's not an answer to your question, but I think it's a really good one. And I'd really like to find the answer.
Yeah, I don't know that there is an answer really, but it's sort of fascinating, isn't it, that we can see this sort of performance play out, and we can just treat it as a performance. I guess a bit like Mary's test context. It's a performance, and that's interesting in itself.
Yes.
Nara, did you have a question?
Oh yes, if there is no other one. So it was very interesting. Thank you very much. It's fantastic project. So I was interested in your idea about the Ikigai, using the Ikigai thing. I think I personally would be very careful with using that kind of thing, because Ikigai is not only Okinawan term, it's throughout Japan, it's used, yeah. And why people in Okinawa is living, they are living so long, there are many reasons. You know, there are research done of what they eat. So for instance, they eat a lot of bitter melon, which is the bitter taste, yeah. It's very good for human health, and normally in general we don't get actually enough bitter taste food. So, and there are a lot of other explanations, and I'm a bit suspicious myself about that concept, because the Okinawans has got this concept of Ikigai, but Ikigai, the concept is used everywhere in Japan. And for instance, a few years back, one of my friend who stayed for a while in Germany, and her mother insisted sending rice from Japan to her and she's not at all from Okinawa, yeah. And then she said, well, I'm allowed to send her the rice because it is her Ikigai, you know, just taking care of me, right? So it's so I have to be careful. I would be careful with using that kind of concept, actually.
Yes, that's I completely understand what you're saying, and I think that's completely reasonable. It's not we can't make a direct and singular link between that language and longevity. This was just one of the lifestyle factors that was identified amongst Blue Zone communities, was a vocabulary for purpose. And because we're speaking of language today, I wanted to draw attention to that. But there were 9 lifestyle factors that were identified within that study, and they included diet and lifestyle, certainly outside of language, and certainly there are many factors to that. So I hope that it wasn't, you know, devaluing all of the other factors that absolutely would contribute to longevity and well-being. So thank you for bringing that up.
Okay, thanks. And the other, I'm not so sure the 9 factors, whether it is included religion, because in Okinawa, the you know, religion, the women play a huge role, and they're singing, and this kind of the spiritual part. I'm not so sure whether it is included, but if not, that might be actually much more important. Yeah.
So, Cass, I'm not sure if it's me or if it's you, but you look like you might have frozen momentarily. Nara, has Cass frozen for you?
Yes. Yes.
Oh, okay. It's not just me.
Problem, I think.
Yeah, we'll just give it a minute.
Yeah.
Brian, I see that you have a question. So when we get Cass back, if you wouldn't mind asking that question, that would be great.
So it seems she dropped out, so it might be connection problem there.
Yeah, yeah. Sometimes people reappear after. We just learn to be so patient with these new constraints, don't we?
No, it's fantastic little project. It's very, very, very well done.
Yeah, yeah. It's wonderful that there's the capacity at ANU to supervise such diverse methods and interests. Actually, it's terrific.
It seems she's having problem with.
So yes, she seems to have a problem, and we are almost.
Yeah.
And we can just have a break.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. I shall save the chat for Cass, and